PowerPoint's coming to your Teams right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This is the second Funding Round Working Group meeting with the board. And we're going to get started pretty quickly here, but just a quick overview today. We have Garrett Balladrosa from our team who's going to talk about how we got to this funding round point. We did a lot of work during the last funding round to get the guidelines and framework that we used this time. And so we wanted to acknowledge that and kind of talk about the things that had changed and carried forward from that into this effort. And then we're going to do a deep dive of some of the outcomes of the funding round we just went through, which I think is really important to, especially for the folks that weren't part of this funding round, to kind of see how things shook out in more detail than we have presented before, which will serve, I think, as a really great basis to just identify some things that we might need to resolve as we go forward with the next funding round framework guideline development. So I am going to turn it over to Garrett. But actually, I first want to acknowledge we have a new member.
Yes.
Here representing Yuba City, Sutter County. So thank you. Welcome. Happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us. We're happy to have you participate in the group. Now, you're static. You're going to stay as part of this group?
That's my understanding.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome. We appreciate you taking the time to come down and be here. So Garrett, you want to kick off?
Perfect. Well, thanks, Christina, for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah, you as the SACOG board just adopted in April, right, the most recent SACOG funding round, but we did want to take a step back and talk about the one before, just because Christina said there was so much work that went into it. I got a kick of, I was looking at some of the materials to get ready for this, and the folder was called the 2020 funding round, but it actually happened in 2021, in that there was just so much feedback and great input that came in, right? We really took our time to try to hear that and understand it. Thank you, Robert. And I want to, we're trying to stay at this maybe Goldilocks level of talking about kind of these, real big issues and how they got translated. So I'm trying to find that balance of, what happened, but not go down to the nitty gritty. On page 7, we did this. On page 8, we did that, right? So if you want more detail, let me know. If you want less detail, let me know, and please interrupt me at any point. But basically,
before do we need to take care of the nuts and bolts of the business and the consent and the call to order the meeting? And I think we probably need to take care of those nuts and bolts first before we dive into the meat of this.
I want to make sure that this gentleman right here has enough time to say all he needs to say. So I just jumped right into it.
All right,
yes,
so
please.
Let's back up just a little bit, and I'd like to call to order the Funding Round Working Group meeting of June 15th, 2023. And I appreciate the enthusiasm, Christina, in diving into this. With that, do we need to do the Pledge of Allegiance? Or are we okay with that since we did it at SACOG? Okay, do we need to take a roll call?
We do need to do a roll call.
All right, let's do the roll call, please.
Directors, when I call your names, please indicate your presence. Director Branscombe?
Yes.
Desmond?
Here.
Guerrero?
Here.
Boomgarden for Harris?
Here.
Joyner?
Here.
And Chair Thomas.
Perfect, here, thank you. And do we have any public communications?
There's no public comment at this time.
All right, thank you. And so we now move on to the consent calendar to number 1, approve the remote working group meeting and minutes. So I move to approval by Guerrero, second by Joyner. And so do we take a roll call? Or can we just say all those in favor? Perfect.
You do?
We do. Okay, let's do this officially.
Directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Branscombe?
Yes.
Desmond?
Aye.
Guerrero? Boomgarden for Harris?
Yes.
Joyner?
Aye.
And Chair Thomas.
Aye.
Motion
All right,
carries.
with that, now let's dive into the overview of the funding round working group goals.
We just couldn't
Take
help
it away,
We're just
Garrett.
that excited, yeah.
That's right.
So, with the onset of every funding round, right, we in prior cycles really tried to, understand what we were doing, what worked, what didn't, right? But it really came to a head this 2 cycles ago, right, the 2021 funding round. There was just a lot of input, and it really a lot of comments came in, and so we really took the time, right, to try to understand, is the funding round working the way it's intended to be, and not. And so we came out with this new framework that was new in 2021, very similar to what you saw in 2023. I want to talk less about the process, but happy to talk if there's a specific question about that, because I kind of, again, want to talk about those big ideas about what were we hearing from stakeholders, what were we hearing, and how we tried to think about how those issues could work within what at that time was the 4-county, funding round, which of course is moving to a 6-county funding round. And of course, want to recognize as part of that input in the prior cycle, SACOG did receive a proposal by a group of public works agencies that laid out their thoughts of how the funding round could work. And that was a critical piece of input. It wasn't the only piece of input, but so what we tried to do is understand what were the themes raised in that proposal, right? Where was there common ground? Where could that fit with some of the mechanisms we had been doing in our funding round? And where we landed was this framework, which we call the 2021 funding round framework. So again, a lot of conversations, a lot of ideas. The funding round is a complex, very important process. This is how I organize it in my thoughts. There might be a better way to organize it. But I'm going to talk about three big themes, right? About what we heard in that 2020, 2021 stakeholder engagement, and touch a bit about how then that framework was updated to reflect those big themes. So the first is just priorities. Regional priorities, regional projects, local priorities, local projects, but also how that nests within state and federal objectives. So of course, right, a very big region, rural, suburban, urban, a lot of need, right? A lot of different types of projects. One thing that we heard was that maintenance and state of good repair, I'm going to use those as the same thing, right? Investing in our existing transportation network, both on the roadside and on the transit side, was a critical need that we kept falling farther and farther behind on as a region. So that's not to say it's the only need in the region, but given the diversity of the region, to get almost every stakeholder saying that was a big important step, right? We can talk about there's other needs, of course, and those vary. A rural project might look different from a suburban and urban, but really coalescing around state of good repair as a critical need in the region, right? And how does SACOG's funding program nest within that, given there's also other funding streams that address state of good repair? With that, at the same time, so priority in terms of is the funding round addressing those sort of projects like types? We also heard feedback as is SACOG's funding round addressing like specific projects. For example, local agency Y said my highest priority was A and you're funding B. Like why is that? And we want to understand it. So it's not just individual projects. It's not just project types, individual projects. So again, two flavors of the idea of regional priorities. And I think the framing we took was totally understand, right, the need at the local level. We tried to weigh in as well as, the objectives that the board has endorsed in the MTP in terms of performance outcomes, and then these performance criteria that the state and federal agencies expect to see out of the program are also important. So when we talk about priorities, right, we need to be cognizant of both of those. Good news is there's a ton of overlap, right? I think that was a great finding. I don't think there's not that much daylight between them, but there was some things we tried to work through. But I think overall, that was kind of the thing we tried to look at. So I'm going to recap my 3 points. One is state of good repair as a sort of critical need, right, region-wide. Two is projects, like priority projects, writ large outside of state of repair. Is like, is my, as a little member agency, number one priority project getting funded or not? And then three is, there's also other needs in the region outside of state of repair, but we also have to be thinking about how those nest within the criteria that SACOG as the board has adopted and the criteria and objectives that SACOG, right, follows given the state and federal agencies that we work with. So that's the idea around priorities. I'm going to talk about a couple of the sort of changes we made to the framework that were based out of that conversation. The first is sort of the biggest no-brainer of all time, as we just asked, okay, let's just have everyone list out their priorities in a table as part of the application, right? Doesn't seem like that rocket science, but it was an important thing because I think there was some things lost in translation, right, at the staff level about what is a priority. So at least let's understand it. And then the second, the biggest one is, and we're trying not to get down into acronyms and specific program names, but we really took the funding program, our regional program, right, and we tried to meet two objectives. One is the state of good repair need. And so we created a program called maintenance and modernization, right? But at the same time, we knew that there's a lot of compelling need to do something new to a facility. It might be a new road, it might be a new transit line, or it might be taking an existing facility and completely rethinking it, right? Reducing number of lanes, adding number of lanes, putting way different bike infrastructure than that's currently there, right? So we call that transformative. So those were the two categories we created, right? A state of good repair and a transformative. Now you know, there's only so much money available. That's always going to be a source of policy consideration for you as a board. I did hear in this 2023 cycles, your fellow colleagues, you know, it's a difficult thing to weigh in because yes, we need state of good repair, but yes, we also want to expand the system and think about it. So that's where we landed, is creating these two new programs. And then finally, thinking about how that larger program, that transformative program, could fit with other funding out there. A key takeaway, at least for me, is more and more funding at the state and the federal level is within a competitive framework moving forward, right? So how can the term we use is leverage. How can we also be thinking strategically about the regional dollars and how those can leverage or access those state and federal? So transformative, and again, this is where it gets complicated. There's multiple programs. We stood up what's called the revolving match program. It was very small in the prior framework, but basically the idea was we could use some regional funds as match when then the sponsors, the cities, the counties, transit agencies go after these state and federal programs. If those are successful, right, the match stays. If the application is not successful, the match would come back to the regional program. We could do it in future cycles. So again, it's trying to get at maybe these two big things. State of good repair, there's just such a compelling need, but also, right, these big projects, very expensive, very hard to do. Costs keep going up and up. How can we think about how those also get built in our region? So again, that's kind of the big thing in terms of priorities, right? The maintenance modernization program and the transform. The last thing I would say though is on the maintenance modernization, on the state of good repair, I think a source of healthy sort of discussion has always been state of good repair is a compelling need. Is that alone the scope element that's going to be asked for in the application, or is there something more above and beyond the pavement or the transit vehicle that's going to be asked for in the application? So we did hear from a lot of stakeholders, right, that they say we need to repave our roads, right, they're falling behind. But at the same time, we've weighed in, and the board, your previous iterations of yourselves have weighed in on these funds through the SACOG program are a subset of all the transportation funds being spent in the region, right? We have these outcomes in the MTP now, the blueprint that we want to meet. We think that, and the state and federal agencies have these performance outcomes that they expect to see as these funds are being spent, that we think there is a good discussion to have about what we call maintenance of the pavement condition, but also modernization, right? So the ask in these guidelines were maintenance, but also thinking about those features that do a modernization sort of aspect. A lot of times it's an active transportation investment. It might be sidewalks, it might be bike lanes, but also be more things like operational. It might be a safety improvement. It might be a turn lane, right? Because the turn movements are unsafe because you're turning across two lanes. It might be a modernization in terms of signal timing, right? The signals are outdated and you can move more throughput with new signals. So the program by design was called maintenance and modernization. It wasn't maintenance or modernization, right? That was a source of healthy debate, right? Because many sponsors would prefer that it was straight maintenance, right? I think we weighed in with our perspective on the values of adding the modernization aspect to it based on sort of the blueprint objectives as well as just the federal and state sort of performance outcomes they expect to see with these funds. So that is just my first point. I'm going to pause there because I've been talking a lot at you. I have two more I want to go through, but any questions so far? Because that's a very critical one about how do priorities at the local, regional, and state level all sort of nest together in the SACOG funding program?
Yeah, that's like drinking a fire hose, isn't it? Absolutely, Director Preston.
I spent 30 MetroCap in and closely associated with MetroCap business. I heard a lot of pitches, and if I just heard this pitch, I'd have to say, I really don't understand what you just told me.
Sure. No.
And no offense, it's just so much. So what is your 3-story elevator pitch to describe what you just said? Sure.
I would say we took the prior funding program and we created new categories within it to respond to what we felt were compelling.
What was the prior funding program?
The prior funding program was a large program called Regional Local, and then smaller one-off programs like Community Design, Bike Ped, Green Region. I know, it's right.
You're inclined to
Yeah.
We're in the elevator.
Yes. We're in a skyscraper there. We got a long ways to go to get to the top.
So we changed.
hit the stop button. You can talk as long as you need.
It went to, and you went to, from that to what?
It went to two categories. One, ways are focused on maintenance, but also modernization, right? Existing in our existing road and transit network.
And the other is?
The other is transformative, right? The more catalytic investment, right? That's going to be more expensive. It's going to be harder to do.
The old and the new.
Yeah, that could be one of it. Yeah.
That was a helpful question. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
So a quick way to perhaps attach to that, from an elected's position, Highway 65 desperately needs to be widened. We aren't going to draw down any federal dollars if we don't have some type of bike lane solution alongside of it. It just, even though it probably isn't going to be highly utilized, it needs to be part of the package as we apply. It's just the way the game is playing right now. Sorry, I'm
Not-
cynical.
Not on 60, like not on 60.
No, adjacent.
Adjacent. Can I give just to build on your maintenance and modern, so this is, because I know this was Director Desmond, we've had this discussion, right? But in Marysville, just back to Marysville for a second, your city manager, as he's wont to do, is on the case and called us up and said, look, we can do an overlay on this street in Marysville, or I can just do the basic. Or what I'd really love to do is actually build this thing out to be much more multimodal, safer, biking, walking, and we strongly encourage, do that and have our funding be the thing that gives you the modernization.
It's a mix of the old.
Yeah, and you were successful in that grant, but I'm just trying to do the why the maintenance and modernization. It's, sometimes called complete streets. We understand that not every street needs a bike lane, even 65. But we do, why, if you're gonna go in, right, you're gonna go in and redo it, why not do it so that we're making it safer for all users? That's
One
fair.
quick thing to add, sorry. Give a definition is, maintenance modernization is sub $5 million programs. Transformative is everything above and
Okay,
beyond
that's
$5
helpful.
million.
Okay.
So that's the distinction kind of between
Okay.
small and big.
No,
that they're trying
okay.
to make.
Thank
So-
you for that, Chris.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hold it up. Maintenance is sub 5, what's the other?
Generally
Anything
over 5 million unless it had a road capacity increasing element to it.
So
Those are the
that
two
has a
big-
bias towards transformation.
Yes.
And where's that bias come from?
What do you mean by bias?
Well, no.
Those are gonna have to be more
If more money is, it sounds like a lot more money is going into transformative. Or is there a collection? Or is there a collection of the maintenance that has it equal to transformative?
It's just that the transformative are more expensive typically. So they're usually bigger ticket projects.
Then what's the total, if you put each in a basket, how full is each basket?
Yeah. Actually, you as a board for this cycle weighed in, and roughly you said 75% in the maintenance and modernization, 25% in the transformative. So fewer projects in the
Interesting.
transformative. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we will have those conversations in the future.
That's very.
Yeah, when the
very
next
useful
round
to know.
comes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions on this?
And I appreciate, first of all, at the outset, I want to say, I'm not going to sit here again because I didn't know I was this bald. I have the camera in the back of my head. It's very disturbing. But, so thank you, James, for bringing that up. And I want to also preface this with, I made some comments at our last board meeting, about the competitive round. And then we had a meeting afterwards with Chris and Christina and James. So I really appreciate that, you making time and some additional conversations we've had. And in terms of the modernization, also appreciate that. I think one of the challenges is, and you've probably heard from the SAC DOT people, is that the conditions are so bad over such a large area that I'm gonna turn this off, I'm sure. Do I need to keep this on?
Probably for recording.
Okay, we got. There's like
Posterity,
feedback.
when people listen to this.
Okay.
You will be quoted.
Yeah, but in terms of that modernization, and I agree with you. I mean, philosophically, we all want those additional things, but it's just the dollars then don't go as far. So that's one of our biggest concerns in Sac County, is that it's hard for us to maybe meet some of the modernization parameters that you put in place if we want to actually get, more bang for our buck because the need's so big. So is there, a discussion about that or about maybe, and part of this, I understand completely, part of it's educational for the various transportation agencies, right? About what some of those modernization components can be that aren't going to break the bank, and aren't going to mean that we have to put everything on this one corridor to the exclusion of others.
Yeah, I think those are the types of conversations when we come back in September with, which is our plan to come back with something for you all to react to, with some semblance of like what framework would look like for the funding round. That's, I think, the appropriate time to start to talk about like, what are the actual programs that we're trying to design and what are we trying to achieve with those? And so that will get to kind of your point of the maintenance and modernization versus fixed first, like how can we accommodate all the needs in programs that work across the region? Because not everybody has the same exact need. So that's the big discussion.
And that's where you'll be drilling down into more details on those kinds of things with our subject matter experts from each of the
Correct.
municipalities. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
We're just learning right now kind of how we got to this point, and then we'll go through this funding round. And I have some data on this funding round, and then we'll talk about how that impacts and speaks to the next.
Yeah, so to clarify, we're going to be diving a little deeper in the September and December meetings once the staff working group has had a chance to really put some of these details together, recognizing that this board will always stay at a higher level and let the staff working group dive deeper into the weeds to them. So I think it's going to be a really productive process as we move forward.
Great, yeah. And I appreciate Dr. Bransom too, like the comment, it's very well taken. Because, sometimes you're in the weeds and you need to take a step back. So that was the first point, right, of priorities, maintenance and modernization, but also transformative. The second sort of theme, that came out of the last cycle was the strong desire, right, and the need or the wish for certainty within these funding program, but how that nests within a competitive framework. And I know the sport is well aware of that, so I'm not going to rehash it, but obviously that was at the crux one of the main sources of discussion, right? I think there were things we thought about, right, and that's where we tried to understand, right, again, okay, the desire is formula. Why is the desire formula? It's pretty self-evident. Of course, it would be much easier if an agency knew how much money was coming in terms of making along their own capital improvement program. Are there ways that we could be thinking about stability or confidence within a competitive framework? We spent a lot of time talking with sponsors about that. So two things we made that go back to those, remember the maintenance and modernization and the transformative, right? Within a competitive framework, how we can be thinking about, right, the very real, right, feedback we heard about how critical these funds are, right? And so the first thing we did is we had a project sponsor priority be a criteria in maintenance and modernization, in that there is a breadth of outcomes or criteria that a project would be evaluated on. The primary ones are the performance side of things, right? What's the maintenance? How is that going to improve it, and what's the modernization benefit? But it's coupled or in tandem with the project sponsor priority. So that was on the maintenance and modernization. And then on the transformative, we thought about ways of, right, prior frameworks had as a policy that the board adopted a focus on small and medium-sized awards. So by definition, these transformatives are larger awards. So we moved, there used to be a sort of a $5 million cap. So projects go above that. We also piloted the ability for some projects to get what's called a multi-cycle award. So you could get some funding in cycle one and some funding in cycle two. Of course, there's trade-offs because then you as a board in that second cycle would have fewer dollars because some of them are already spoken to, right? And then the third was we tried to also think critically about how that transformative program fit within the state and federal competitive programs, where it wasn't a guarantee, but at least if they're talking the same language, right, you could get an award there, at least it gives you that fighting chance in those other programs. So we thought critically about, we very much heard, right, the desire, right, our assessment was, right, we weighed in heavily about why we thought the competitive framework was the way to go, right, but we thought there was ways we could at least be thinking about, certainty, stability within that framework. And so those were some of the changes we did. And then the last one I would say too is, regardless of category, we really scaled up what we called the pre-application consultation. Before applications were due, sit down with every agency, talk through it, weigh in with assessment of our understanding of the guidelines, our understanding of, what we expect, projects to accomplish. It's, not always the easiest conversation to have, but at least having that conversation up front, right? I think there is some value in that. And so at least, right, it's not, we're just applying without any feedback. It's not like we didn't ever talk prior to the 2020 funding round, but we made it an explicit thing about we're going to talk with each agency in advance of the application period. What are your priorities? Let's talk about them in relation to the criteria that the guidelines have had. So that's the second one again. Certainty, competition, and sometimes, they don't have to be at heads. There's some things we could think about how we could fit those together.
Any other questions at this point on our agenda?
Okay, third one's easy. Process, okay? It takes a lot of time to apply to grants. We apply to grants all the time, and sometimes you're like, gosh, why do we have to do that exhibit or that form or whatever? And we get it, and the feedback we heard, which is valid, is every dollar spent applying to these grants is one fewer dollar that goes towards, projects. We get that. We tried really hard to think about ways to streamline some things. These are state and federal dollars. Some forms we have to use, right? But we did really try to think hard about that. So I don't want to cast that aside. I know it's less important or maybe less interesting from a policy perspective for you as the board, but for your local agencies, it's very important about how much time does it take to apply to this grant. So I could go into details of what we've tried to do over the last several cycles. We've tried, but I think there's some healthy tension in all of these themes. Within a competitive framework, you need to have, right, sort of reasoning, you need to have evidence. We've done a lot of work on the data side. So we're trying to find that Goldilocks of, a simple, streamlined application that also we can then say with a straight face to the board and to the state and federal partners, these are the outcomes we think these projects are going to meet. So just wanted to call attention to the process side of things too. And there might not ever be the perfect way to land, but there's always, I think, things we can think about how we can streamline the number of programs, and then also how we can think about within that program itself, how much material we ask for. So hopefully it got better, Director Branscombe, from the first to the third.
Catch it before somebody else tells me to turn it on. So we carried that same framework forward, the maintenance and modernization program, the transformative, and we also ran the community design program at the same time. Those three programs launched. You guys approved the guidelines for those in October of last year, and then we did a call for projects early in November. Good, that works. So before we did those guidelines, before we crafted them and brought them to you for adoption, we did, much like what Gary was talking about, we did extensive outreach with all of our jurisdictions in the 4-county region. We went out to every single jurisdiction and every other partner that applies for our program, sat down with them for an hour to an hour and a half, talked through their projects and strategy, and helped them, here's what's coming. The programs are very similar to last year. We're making some small changes here, and walk them through that. Gave us an opportunity to really hear a lot from the staff at that time. What we heard really echoed a lot of what Garrett heard. A lot of maintenance is still a tremendous priority. And that we also heard, this is the middle of the pandemic, that staff resources were really spread very thin. And that applications can be a challenge, but they really appreciated the streamlined process that we did last time. So we also carried that whole regime forward into this program. We did make a couple small modifications because of that maintenance focus that we heard. We had a smaller amount of money this time than we did last time because we ran a funding round probably within almost a year of the previous when we started that discussion, and almost right under 2 years approved the next one. So we did not have quite the capacity in this funding round that we had for the last one. So we really had to focus our efforts on that. So because of that, we came to you when we adopted the guidelines with a suggestion of limiting the transformative program to 25% of the total pot, leaving 50% towards maintenance and modernization, and then the remaining 25% to the revolving match program, which we had lifted up earlier in the year and had gone through a round and already had some successes on. And I'll talk a little bit more of that program in a minute. So the other thing we did is we added, in alignment with our Racial Equity Action Plan and strategic planning initiatives, we added some equity questions into, well, some elements into the questions in the application. We did not want to go through and really reconstruct the framework, because we like that framework moving forward, but wanted the ability for jurisdictions to address equity in their jurisdictions through that if they wanted to. So we gave them some of that flexibility, but it was not a performance outcome, much like we had had in other measures. And as we get into the discussion of the programs, I'll talk about the performance metrics and how they factor in. Wrong computer. So, as I said, we released a call for projects in early November with applications due, and these were 3 programs. It was community design, maintenance and modernization, and transformative. Applications were due starting in January and ending in February. In front of you is the distribution of the applications. This is not the amount of dollars. This is strictly the number of applications submitted from each county. Next to that is the funded applications. This is, again, the number of applications. This is not the dollar amounts. Moving through. Very, very similar with some slight outliers here, but very similar in the general distribution for the 4 counties. So one thing I should note when I started, these slides are really intended to stop and have a conversation on them. If you have questions, feel free to stop me and I'll pause there for a second. If anybody has any questions on this. Yes.
So help me understand this, because, so you're saying Sacramento, for instance, Sacramento County comprised 67% of the total applications from all jurisdictions within the county.
All jurisdictions in the county, yes.
And that 66% of those got funded?
Correct.
Okay. That's total number, yeah.
Total number of applications, not dollar amounts.
No, and I get that, So 66% of Sacramento County's applications got funded, 11% of Sutter County's applications got funded.
11% of the total number of applications
Okay.
funded were from.
So then help me with the math, because, I mean, I think Sacramento County submitted how many applications?
Your jurisdiction alone submitted 18 applications.
And less than half of those were funded, I believe.
Correct.
But we're also.
So where am I missing? What am I?
Community design.
So community design is included in here as well.
Okay.
But also Sacramento County has the most jurisdictions.
Right.
And so City of Sacramento, Galt, Folsom, Citrus Heights, Elk Grove. But yeah.
So you're saying a lot of those, obviously, to make up for that,
Correct.
more than closer to 100% of their applications would have been funded in Sacramento County, right? And
There
that's
we
how you get up to the 66%.
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions with this? Okay. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into the community design program. This was the 10th year or the 10th cycle of this program. This program was launched with the original blueprint 20 years ago, as it is designed to fund transportation projects that drive land use changes with those blueprint ideals. So it's always been a standalone program and kind of unique in its regard, in that regard. With the program that Garrett ran, they saw the first of we've always had a level of non-competitive level 1 applications. When I say level 1, these were immediate non-competitive asks for $100,000 to do planning work. That came from SACOG managed funds, so they're flexible funds. But if they got one of those awards, they could not apply for a competitive award. So basically, it was an easy, we want to do this work, it's defined under $100,000. We can apply for it, and then they just don't compete with the other programs. With the start of the 2021 round, they increased a different level 2 non-competitive that tapped into the federal and state sources of dollars, that went up to a max of $400,000. Same requirement, could not compete with the competitive programs. So this really ties back. We saw 7 applications come through on this, where I think 1 came through on the previous round. This really ties back to that. What we heard, I think, at that outreach is that staff resources are spread really thin. For the competitive, we received 8 applications. All of those applications were from agencies within Sacramento County. The non-competitive came from jurisdictions from the other 3 counties and some Sac County applications. But really, I think when you dive into this and you look into this, what they're asking for here with a lot of planning activities and a lot of activities to get projects ready for a competitive funding round. So my takeaway from the structure and how this went is that as we look into the next round, should we take a look at maybe a planning-focused funding program? We spent approximately $3 million going through this to fund those level 2 projects and level 1 combined, with the remaining $10 million of the community design funded 4 projects out of the 8 that were. Yeah.
Do we have any idea of what the outcome of this planning work was? Was this successful? Did this help move projects forward in the region?
So not yet, because we just awarded those.
Oh, I guess so, yeah.
So,
2023,
but
that's right.
historically, on the level 1, we have seen our smaller jurisdictions come in for these and move projects forward. I will note, some of these applications take a tremendous amount of staff, SACOG staff resources, because they're generally smaller jurisdictions. Sometimes the scopes change, and we would like to probably put a little more guidelines and a little more structure on this program. But it does take a fair amount of our time to work with our agencies to move these forward. But we've had some that have tapped this resource every funding round. So
It'll be helpful this year to, as we move through this year, to understand though the fruit of this, because if those smaller jurisdictions don't have that expertise and we don't have this support, what are the ramifications of that going to be? So that'll be interesting to kind of monitor this.
So I can answer your question from the 2021 round, or 2021 round. At some point I'll get that right. The one level 2 award, I believe last time, was West Sacramento. And they used that funding to do analysis on the Sacramento Avenue. And that is moving forward right now. So the first award that we gave in that category is being utilized. And I think, well. Okay.
Good, that's good news. All right, thank you.
Any other questions on this? Okay. I keep trying to change it on my computer. It's not my computer. So to dive into the biggest program from this round was maintenance and modernization. So what you're seeing up here is basically the number of applications received. Again, I'm using just the number of applications received. For this program, let me back up. The current MTPSCS has 7 outcomes that it uses, performance outcomes. We use these in the funding round and score on these in the funding round. So for the maintenance and modernization program, every application received is judged on its stated good repair. Every one of the 42 that were received had to be scored on that. And then applicants are able to pick 2 performance outcomes that they want to speak to. What you're seeing here are, out of those 2, if they had options, here's what they chose on the received, and then here's what was funded through the working groups. So what we're seeing is a lot of repaving projects that are increasing multimodal options. I'm happy to send this to you, Director Branson, if you'd like it.
Please do.
Yes. And
It's very interesting.
but you can see, from this slide, the funded applications leaned towards increased multimodal options, and a lot of safety improvements, leaned away from improved goods movement and reducing VMT and providing long-term economic benefits. Well, there was a slight increase in those. I'm still looking at the applications to really kind of understand why this is as we dig into this, but I think it's important that, and I think there's some natural elements that go with a repaving project, or like whether it's restriping for a bike lane or fixing security and safety issues, things like that. One point of note, though, is that requirement for a state of good repair scoring worked at the detriment of other projects that might have been strictly a safety project, because they could have picked just one and spoke to it and gotten well scored. So we saw there's a couple jurisdictions that had some safety projects that were not state of good repair projects, but were just correcting a safety issue, that were bumped out of the funding range because of that requirement for that. So I think one of our initial findings here is that this program might be a little too rigid on that, and maybe there are some ways that we could reform it to increase some of the options for this program. To kind of better define maintenance, we tend to speak about maintenance, modernization, and transformativeness, the big program and the small program. For the small program, it might be more flexible, really, to have some more options for jurisdictions to choose from. They can still choose maintenance projects and repaving projects that are still obviously can be prioritized through here. But for another jurisdiction that doesn't have that issue as much, they might need to fix a safety issue. That could make it more.
So are you considering perhaps a maintenance, safety, and modernization program? Is that kind of what you're thinking, potentially, or?
Or just removing the requirement for strictly safety, state of good repair, scoring first, and just being able to pick two that they want to speak to.
Okay.
It could be safety and economic benefits, but let the jurisdictions choose those and speak to them.
Adding extra flexibility at the local level.
Correct.
To meet their needs. Right, to
Right.
meet their, yeah, great, okay.
And these are the simpler applications, the more streamlined applications that were created in the 2020 round that are about 7 pages and some supporting materials. These are fairly straightforward, easy applications to draft and to submit. Any other questions on this? If they occur to you, we can go back. So I'm going to move on to the transformative, similar slide. So for transformative, this was an interesting program this year because, again, it was capped at $28.5 million. And these are the large projects. These are the transformative projects. So we received 17 applications for approximately $170 million in requests for a $28.5 million pot of money. It was hyper competitive. So as we reviewed those applications, and so what you're seeing here is they don't have a requirement for any one performance measure. So applicants on this program got to choose 2 performance measures, and all 7 are indicated here, whether it's reduce VMT, state of good repair, reduce congestion, increase multimodal options, improve safety, security, economic benefits, and goods movement. They got to choose from those, choose 2 to speak. So what we funded out of those were 6 projects out of those 17. And nearly every one of those got a haircut. I think only one got fully funded. And I believe that was the Sac County one because it was a small ask. But yeah, it was a very competitive round, and we did everything we could in that round. But for the funded projects, what we're seeing here is really that when things are hyper competitive, you see things gravitating towards, and I think this really comes down to where our jurisdiction articulates the benefits really well, and that's increased multimodal options, that transit, that bike ped, those other options, and safety and security. And then second to those is reducing VMT. What we didn't see in here funded is that economic benefit, the economic development portion of it. And I'd like to do a little deeper dive at some point. I'm going to be doing that to see why that is. They just weren't articulated well or what it is. But just a couple of the applications use those performance metrics.
Who made the decision? I'm new. Who made the decision on what was funded and what wasn't? Was it a group like this?
You're right. I'm sorry. I should have walked through the review process and the groups. So we took the applications when they came in February, screened them, assembled working groups. For maintenance and modernization, there were 3 working groups that scored. Those working groups are all made up of local jurisdiction staff, planners, engineers, and managers. Also some SACOG staff as well. So we reviewed 42 maintenance modernization applications, 17 transformative. Transformative had 2 review groups. And again, same kind of general makeup. Just mostly your staff reviewed these and sat with us and put a ton of time into reviewing all these applications. So these scores came from those review groups.
Good question.
Yeah.
What's remarkable on that, what's remarkable to that for me is 15% were to provide long-term economic benefits and 0% went for that.
Right. That's something I'd like to look into as well.
And it's just interesting. And
We
I won't burden you now.
Yeah.
We have a comment.
Oh, wow. A lot of times it has to do with the tools they have available as well. So it could be some of that, right? Is what tools you have available to actually, display these outcomes to SACOG? If you don't have that, what else do you come up with to provide that?
It would be interesting to see just a summary of the proposals made. And because perhaps they were weak proposals, right? Or perhaps they met with some bias in favor of other outcomes or against. It'd be interesting to see those. I'm not making any accusations, just when you go from that to 0, it's just interesting.
Well, it sounds like we're reviewing that at a staff level. Yeah,
Absolutely.
doing a deep
Yeah,
dive on
no,
that.
I want to know more about that because that was something I identified and was curious about as well.
Great, okay. Oh, can you push your button, Director Guerrero? Go.
Reducing congestion and what you found, why from 23 to 8%?
My overall off-the-cuff assessment of that is they were probably larger freeway projects. And this round had so little funding that those are very challenging to fund through this $28.5 million. That they're just larger projects and they did not have that probably the ability to really affect that.
And that may have been the answer. The size of the pot may not have been big enough to even think about long-term economic benefits because the other elements may have been so worthy of the capital. I get
Good point.
it. Thank you.
It's a unique program this round because it was so competitive that we're seeing a real tightening of every concept in this. So I think it's going to be unique. So.
Great, okay.
So these are some just kind of preliminary findings that kind of go through some of the conversations we've already had. I kind of want to walk through these a little bit. The ones labeled P are really process. And really that maintenance modernization, that rigidity into that program really comes at a detriment to smaller other projects, something we could definitely take a look at. These are also meant to be a little bit of a start. We also want to hear from you on what you think you saw out of this and what you think we should move forward changing. The other, and this is a process question that I haven't really touched on yet, and that is running a large 3-program funding round over the holidays during state SB1 programs and all the federal programs kind of blew local agencies out of the water. And quite frankly, it blew our staff out of the water too. It was, I think there are some ways to adjust that process where we, depending on what this new structure looks like, if there's multiple programs, we could run them concurrently and not to run them all at the same time. More of a slow burn than a big, fast fever pitch application. And I should let you know, my previous job before SACOG was the grant writer for one of the jurisdictions sitting at the table here today. So I understand some of those pressures and from their staff well. So, and between that, also looking at the calendar to say, maybe we run our funding round. SB1 rounds go every 2 years. And maybe we try to fit it into that year in between. So that allows a more strategic lens for how we're positioning our funding towards larger state and federal applications too. And I'm remembering I didn't touch on revolving match that much in this program. Let me just, did you have a question? No. Okay. In April of 21, we launched well, we didn't launch because Garrett's program launched the effort, but it was only utilized by one jurisdiction unsuccessfully. We made it a little more robust, and this board put some money behind it, and we launched the first round of it. And we just today adopted the second cycle of those awards. On that first cycle, we've had 3 successes out of the 4 applications that were submitted. It's been a fairly successful program. $7.5 million has been now dedicated to those projects moving forward. One in West Sacramento, one in Sac County, and one for Capitol Corridor for the third track project. Brought in that $7.5 million has literally turned into $75 million in grant awards moving forward. So the more that we look at, especially now that we're in this new environment with IIJA and federal funds and state funds, to better leverage some of our more limited funds into a program like this to really move these big projects that we don't have the capacity for. Programs like this, I think, are definitely something that should be looked at as we move forward as probably successful and really meeting its mark.
I spoke my ride and I have scheduled. I'm going to pick up on this on the recording.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Director Branscombe. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And then, okay, so I paused in the middle of these, and I apologize for that. The 2 topical ones, as I alluded to in the community design program, maybe a planning-focused funding program would be beneficial to our partners because we're clearly they're identifying that to us as a need through those non-competitive awards. But also in this last one, I think is really big. And I think it really speaks to, and I'm sorry, Branscombe had to leave, that economic development. The triple bottom line, the economy, environment, and equity need to be better integrated into our funding round moving forward. That was adopted after the framework that Garrett had carried forward. So we now have an opportunity to really integrate that into the next round and to maybe better address some of the economy portions of it and then new concepts around equity.
Sure, absolutely.
So you alluded to the equity. How would you integrate it in if it wouldn't become a performance metric? Yeah, that was just my.
Yeah, that's something we really need to spend some more time with, especially in this group and with the staff group, about how to address. We have some other parallel initiatives moving forward in our agency, whether the racing, the action plan, and the Engage, Empower, and Implement programs that are kind of moving forward at the same time that will help educate those as we go through. But it's definitely something we want to take a look at.
Are any of those 3 E's, are they included in the state or federal policy considerations?
Absolutely.
Oh, they are. So
Equity at
So
the
you
federal
could-
level is just as 40,
you
cap
could,
tie
you
is
could,
the other
incor-
two.
I mean, could you incorporate it into as a performance metric? Could you incorporate it that way? I mean, I guess you could, right? I mean, it's trying to figure out how you're gonna
Generally
use it.
speaking, or along the lines of what state and feds are asking?
Probably well, I guess
Hmm.
both. I mean, could you do it either way?
We probably should do a deeper dive, because I know last time disadvantaged communities came up a bunch, right? And this causes angst across the 6 counties, totally understand. But I will say there's kind of two ways typically that people are looking at equity. One is sort of a process level. Have communities been engaged? And that, I think, is relevant across all 6 counties. That's why we went to Roseville. We're going to be talking a lot more about that this year. Second is it's the sort of the performance and the data piece of it, which I was just asking Garrett to remind me. It's a little bit like the economic development piece, right? Which is like we want to have projects show some data around economic benefit. It is heretofore, I think, been a little difficult, right? Everybody would say, if you're sponsoring a project, my project benefits the economy. There are, though, I think, some ways in which equity can be defined as accessibility. I mean, you all were talking about this morning at the board meeting. Access to healthcare, access to jobs, access to schools. And that, and again, if this group wants to have a little bit of a dive into some of the data and some of the mapping and some of the tools, it's pretty interesting, because the accessibility idea, in other words, what can I get to? How fast can I get to it? That I think is relevant across all 6 counties. And I think it's a good way to think about equity. So because you can break it out by lower income populations, disadvantaged populations.
It's also a very interesting discussion when we can think about the blueprint process and how we're anticipating growing.
And as you know, I don't tell you, Director Thomas, like in rural areas, right, accessibility is real
Huge,
and the lack
right.
thereof.
Huge issue. Yeah. I believe we're going to have a deeper discussion on equity next month at the September meeting, right? Correct. Yeah. So great. Look forward to that.
Those are my slides and my general presentation. And I'm happy to take any other comments on findings or things that we want to, concepts that you found out of this.
I think we've been asking along the way. So
Right, okay.
yeah, really. And want to encourage us all that this is supposed to be an interactive process, and our staff is encouraging, questions and comments along the way. So, thank you all for engaging this.
Can I bring up one more thing?
Of course.
And I bring this up in the board meeting. You've heard me say it a lot of times, and James and I have had the discussion. And I know the formulaic discussion is something, we cannot do that, and I understand why. Something that I've talked to you about and we've discussed is that, and I understand just the nature of this entity. There are going to be years where some jurisdictions are going to be getting more. I mean, that's how it's structured. That's why we have this regional approach. But my concern in Sacramento County in general, and certainly the unincorporated area, is just that there is, I know it's not a factor, but that you look and are cognizant of over time is something way out of whack with, oh boy, this jurisdiction is not, we've noticed there's an anomaly here. Maybe we need to be doing more with their staff to make sure they're more competitive, or clearly something's off in terms of them not getting funds, So there has to be a sense of fairness, but over time, not year to year. And James, you and I have had this discussion, but I think everybody on this, who's on this entity, shares that sentiment, I think.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot engaging your staff and jurisdiction staff for debriefs. We met with you and also met with your staff separately to debrief on these applications. I'm doing those now after the funding round. We've had, I think, 3 or 4 of them already to really how can you be more successful? Is this the right strategy for you? Are you telling the right story with your application? So we're doing a lot of engagement to really work with the jurisdictions to do that and to be a resource as much as we can. Because we do things from prior to the guideline discussion, talk with them. During the application period, we're open for calls, questions, thoughts. I've worked with a lot of different jurisdictions as the applications are open. So
Great. Wonderful. Okay. So now we're on to what's next for the funding round working group.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think we've touched on some of it here, but we'll be holding the staff level working group next month, and hope to get a lot of substance that we can take back. So over the next few months, what we're going to be doing is starting to put together some framework around prioritization of projects in the region and how that fits into the funding round, but also some potential scenarios for this funding round. What are we going to do with the federal dollars? How do the state dollars play in? And really have I think, a very productive, very engaging, collaborative discussion on what we should be focusing on moving forward from a structural standpoint of this funding round. We're going from a 4-county to a 6-county. And so there's a lot of nuances there that I think we need to address in terms of how we run these programs, what these programs are looking like as we move forward. So our big task over the summer is going to be formulating that so we can have a really good discussion. I think part of that is also looking back even more into detail in this funding round too. I think we're going to probably have some other metrics that we might pull out that help support maybe why we're presenting some of the things that we're presenting. I think data is really going to play a role here in trying to tell the story and try to make sure that, looking at 1 year alone, I don't think is necessarily going to be the end all be all, because we've got 2 new counties coming in that don't have the data to support that. So I think it's data plus anecdotal. So that's where the staff level working groups are going to be very, very, very important for this process moving forward. We will be meeting with the staff. We're going to try to meet with the staff level working groups monthly moving forward from September on, because that's when we're going to have the real back and forth of what are the priorities here that we're trying to work with. So those are the next steps. So I think September, I've talked with our folks here that help us schedule. What we're hoping for, I'm going to just give you a little heads up on this, is maybe more than an hour of time with you all, because we're going to start to have some much bigger conversations, and I think we need a lot more time for it. So hopefully we can find something that works after the board meeting, or I don't know, we'll figure it out. But I hope you all have the time, because I think we really need the time.
Yeah, I think we're all committed to that. This is important.
That's great. That's great. No, so,
And it doesn't have to be after the board meeting.
Okay.
We need to find another day that works for everybody.
okay,
Yes.
That's fine.
okay, that's really good to know.
We'll be flexible.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know. So yeah, I would say that this is kind of the last one of the background type, which I think has been really hopefully useful to understand how we've gotten to this point and what we need to maybe focus on moving forward. So get ready for September. It's gonna be the fun discussion, but I really am looking forward to it. I think we've got some good bones to work with. We're not trying to throw out everything that was done. I think Mr. Busey over there can attest to all the conversations that were had during the last one, and we don't want to discount all the hard work that went into the last one. But there are definitely some things we have to improve on, but also things we need to improve on. So we're looking forward to that.
For speaking for myself, I think this has been incredibly helpful. I'm finally feeling I'm wrapping my head around this thing, and to have a foundation on how we move forward. So I thank you for taking the time, and I don't know how the rest of you are feeling about that, but it's.
Oh, I'm in the same place. I'd
Yeah.
love to have the
Yeah.
slide deck as well. And I take time to process. I'll sit
Yeah.
down
Sure.
with this 2 or 3 different times.
This is new to all of us, and so we're all figuring this out together. So I just really thank you for that. Are there any further questions on how we've gotten here and the foundation that our staff has laid out for us? No? Do we have any public comment on this, Robert?
There's no public comment.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Great. Any other matters that we need to discuss?
No, but I do want to offer up, if you want to have some
Yes.
phone calls to get
That's
Sean
true.
up to speed a little bit more, by all
What I
means,
wanted to
reach
do.
out.
Chris already, yeah, no, I would appreciate it.
Sure.
That's probably a good idea. Forgive us, Mark. Yeah.
No,
We've been dealing with this for a little while, and it's
I
it's
didn't want to
all
bog
interesting.
down the meeting. I can follow up.
Please do.
That's okay.
You jumped in the deep end.
And feel free to always ask any questions. Yeah, because we're all figuring this out together. So with that, it's hard to see the clock, but it's what, like 108?
107.
107, perfect. So with that, deep thanks to our staff and all of you for staying and engaging on this. And with that, we are adjourned.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.